All right, good morning. We were talking about consumer behavior, and we were talking about different types of individuals and their psychographics. So when we talk about targeting, again, segmenting and positioning, in a future lecture, you should remember all of this because we're going to talk about how you can target by psychographics, which is the VALS. I have the first critical thinking challenge posted. I've really struggled with how to do this, but I came up with one for this lecture. You'll have a week to do it, and I will talk a little bit about that in a second when we get to that critical thinking challenge and compare and contrast it with what I expected sort of on the exam. So we were talking about VALS, and we started with innovators, and I think we got through innovators. They seek lots of information, skeptical about advertising, future-oriented, wide variety of interests and activities. And we talked about what kinds of restaurants they might like. And we came up with a variety of restaurants that they might like. And then I think we were talking about, I think we'd gotten to, so this is just sort of as a recap. I think we had started talking about thinkers. And had we talked about what restaurants thinkers might be interested in? Did we get to that? Okay, so that's a good place to start. So thinkers, again, VALS is predicated on two things. Which makes a 2x3 matrix, except there are these two sort of categories, innovators that fall outside, because innovators are motivated by all three sort of categories of motivation, and they have high access to resources. And then we have ones that just fall outside of that, which are survivors, and we'll talk about those. But thinkers, high access to resources, they're highly normative. What does it mean to be highly normative? Well, what that means is that you focus on the ought. You ought to do this. You ought to, live this way. It is a values-laden focus that is generally somewhat maternalistic or paternalistic and moralistic in its outlook. They plan, they research, and I told you, I think maybe that they were subject to what we call analysis paralysis. And did we talk about my notebook in here? Did we talk about the notebook? No. How I buy things, right? So years and years and years ago when I was still married, the microwave went out. I didn't talk about the microwave in here? Okay. So the microwave went out, and I start compiling the notebook. This is the way I go about buying things. Microwaves are enormously complex pieces of machinery. When I grew up as a kid, we got our first microwave. It cost over $1,000, and this was in the late 1970s, I believe, because I was about 6 years old, I think, the year that we got it. My brother was born that year, which was 1979. And the microwave had two switches on it. It had a power switch, and there were two power settings, high and low, and then it had a timer dial. You actually dialed the timer, and it didn't have a revolving tray. It didn't have anything like that with it. And it was $1,000. It was $1,000, and this was, in the 1970s. That was a lot of money. Microwaves are enormously cheap now, but they come with all kinds of features. There's a popcorn feature. So if you can just throw the bag of popcorn in there, you hit the popcorn button, and your microwave is set to basically adjust the power and the time such that the microwave popcorn comes out, just absolutely perfect. And you don't have to think, you don't have to watch it. Again, when I was a kid growing up, if you wanted to pop popcorn in the microwave, you put it in a bowl that was microwave safe, and then you sort of covered it, and you had to listen. You turned the power on, and you turned the dial on, and then you had to listen till it started getting between 1 and 2 seconds per pop. And that's how you do the microwave. That's how you do the popcorn was done. This was a huge leap forward, by the way, from the way we popped popcorn from the years 1 through 5. And I remember popping popcorn. We had a live fireplace, and my dad had this popcorn popper that you'd actually use in the fireplace to pop popcorn. And then they came out with these popcorn poppers that used air. I think when I was about 4 or something, and we had one of those, and you put the butter on the top. It was a big mess, big mess. This microwave thing was really great, but only two things. Microwaves now have all of these different features, right? They have a popcorn feature. They have an automatic defrost feature on many of them. They have the ability to toast. Some of them, like you can buy the microwaves that have the toaster feature in it, so you can go from microwaving to toasting. So I can start compiling the notebook. And I come home one day, and this is an example of analysis paralysis. It was, we'd been without a microwave for over a month. And my spouse at the time, I come home one day and there's a microwave in the kitchen. I'm like, what? What's this? Well, I got a microwave. Huh? Did you consult the notebook? No. What notebook? The notebook. Did you consult the where I'd gone through consumer reports and I'd microwaves come in various powers? Did you consult the notebook? That's analysis paralysis, and that's what thinkers oftentimes engage in. They overanalyze even maybe simple decisions. So they tend not to be satisficers. They tend to be optimizers instead of satisficers. They have a historical perspective. They like history. They like traditional intellectual pursuits. And so history is one of those. And so they can remember things for a long, the way things were a long time ago. And they have this historical perspective. They're enormously financially independent. They're not at all influenced by fads. So whatever is the latest thing that's the greatest and going crazy on the internet or television or stuff, that's probably not going to interest them. And you all have experienced lots of fads. I remember when Beanie Babies were a fad. I think I talked about this in here. That's not going to be something that they're gonna care about. Things like going to Gettysburg are going to be interesting to them. Touring historic homes, that kind of thing is going to be interesting to them. Their use of technology is limited to the extent that it is functional. If it is just for the use of its in and of itself, they're not going to be interested in that. How many of you like to figure out your iPhone? When you got it, you just played with it and you just did everything you could for hours and hours. That's not these people, right? They're not, you played with your iPhone. Why? To figure out what all of the icons were. Did you go through the settings?
Yeah.
And figured out what all of the settings you could, like how you could change your ringtone instantly? Don't care about that, right? What do they use it for? My mother uses it so she can FaceTime her grandkids. It's a very functional. They will learn technology, and they're bright, so they can do this, but it's not going to be because they just enjoy doing it. It's not for the activity in and of itself. Whereas for a lot of you, I would venture to guess that when you get new toys, you value them sort of for the uniqueness of the experience in and of itself, figuring it out, learning how to navigate the product. They don't care about that. They want to know how to navigate it easily. And then use it in a very functional way. So traditional intellectual pursuits, and they buy proven products. Did I talk about the Millionaire Next Door in here? I know I talked about it in my first class the last time. There were these authors that decided to do a study on the average millionaire in the United States. And the average millionaire at that point in time was worth something like $1.5 million. And at the time they did the study, if you were a millionaire, you could retire. If you had $1 million in the bank, you could pretty much live comfortably for the rest of your life. That is no longer the case in terms of what it takes to retire and live comfortably. What they found, they rented this suite at a hotel in the conference area, and they put out caviar and all of these expensive dishes. And they discovered rapidly that the average millionaire was not interested in any of that. The traditional thinkers are the millionaires in many instances next door. They didn't care about caviar. The average car at the time that they wrote the book that the millionaire next door drove was a Ford Taurus. Why? It's not flashy. It's reliable. It was a solid, good. It's a very functional car. 4 doors, big enough to haul the family. Had a good sized trunk in it. You could go on vacation. It was a proven, stable product. It was Ford's #1 selling car for many, many years. And that was the average car that they had. They didn't buy Rolls Royces, they didn't buy Ferraris or Jaguars or things like that. It was a Ford Taurus. The average millionaire next door lived in an average community. They lived in middle class housing and in various places, many in small towns, not in the shallow and pretentious gated communities of Edmond. That's not where they were living. They were living in places like Guthrie and just solidly middle class neighborhoods. What kinds of restaurants do you think would appeal to thinkers. Why? Who wants to give me a restaurant? Why? What do you think?
Maybe like
I sanitized the ducks again, by the way.
like Cracker Barrel, because the menu never changes. It's always the same thing, and there's like cool historical stuff on the wall,
Okay.
old plaza and stuff.
All right. I think you're partly right. I think that is a good example. There will be another category that I think would be better. But when you think about targeting, segmenting, and positioning, you absolutely have to think about that you're going to appeal to more than one target. So I think you are correct. Cracker Barrel harkens, it is historical. You're correct. It harkens back to a time that probably never really existed. This idea of, the 1950s and nostalgia. But yes, it's got lots of stuff. In every Cracker Barrel store, they've got these old signs, road signs, old. And one of the ones that I traveled, that I visited, traveling to New York, they had an old, an actually rebuilt fuel pump. You all have never seen these. It used to be that when you bought gas, and when I was a kid, there was still a gas station across the street from our cabin that had one of these types of fuel pumps in it. You would fill up the jar. There was a glass jar at the top of the fuel pump, and it would fill up, and it had markings in it, either on the glass itself or in most of them, there was a measuring thing, and that was the number of gallons you used. And as you filled up the car, it went down, and people would figure out how many gallons you put in the car, and then they'd go in and ring it up on a cash register. It didn't automatically go into the store. They would, mark down. They write down a little pad or remember it and walk inside and tell you. And there were actually, when I was growing up as a kid, and this gas station that was across the street from our cabin was one of these places that actually was like this. They actually had full service. People would actually come out and pump your gas and wash your windshield. Have any of you experienced a full service gas station in your life? No, I didn't think you had. They're a thing of the past. So yeah, things like that would appeal to them. Anybody else have an idea about what might appeal to a thinker? Remember, they have high access to resources. They like proven products. Historical perspective. Nobody else can think of anything? The one that I usually come up with, for those of you who are from Oklahoma, there's a chain of restaurants that are Hal Smith properties here in Oklahoma called Charleston's. That is something that would absolutely appeal to thinkers. It's upscale, casual dining. It's got sort of a very standard, traditional American menu, but it's good. It's steak and potatoes, but it's not just, tater tots and fries. It's good. That's the restaurant that I usually come up with as the classic example. Oops, wrong computer. Better remember which technology I'm using. Believers, on the other hand, have low access to resources, but again, they're motivated by ideals. They believe that basic rights lead to the good life. Somebody said in urban, it's similar to Charleston's. I think that's probably a good example as well. It's a staple here in Edmond for a long time. They used to have more interurbans across the city. Most of them have closed. The only other interurban that I know of, there's one in Norman and there's one in Ardmore now.
Isn't there one on Memorial too still?
Is there one on Memorial?
There was, yeah. It's like between MacArthur and.
Yeah, but I think that's absolutely. It's not McDonald's, but it's also not the latest and greatest where you're going to get sushi and although they might like sushi, you're going to get very exotic types of foods. You've been to the one in Ardmore. Yeah, I've been to the one in Ardmore too. I go to Dallas a lot. So they believe that basic right and wrong lead to a good life. They have enormous amounts of faith and spirituality. They like friendly communities. In order to escape from reality, their escapes are reading romance novels and watching TV. They like stability, and they're enormously brand loyal. They view advertising as a legitimate source of information. Whereas innovators are enormously skeptical of advertising, they view this as a legitimate source of advertising. So what kinds of restaurants would believers like?
Chick-fil-A.
Somebody in my first class said Chick-fil-A, and I'm going to agree with you. I think they do. It's a proven product. They like it's based on a traditional. I mean, why is Chick-fil-A closed on Sunday? It's founded by people who have this Christian values. Again, I think Chick-fil-A is the tool of the devil. Their supply chain, by the way, is not closed on Sundays, and so I view that as being enormously hypocritical. But I think you are absolutely correct that they would like Chick-fil-A. I also think that they would like Cracker Barrel because it's very traditional. It's good, solid American food, and they're brand loyal.
What about Golden Corral?
I think Golden Corral is another one that they probably would like. It's got lots of variety. Forever and ever, there are fewer Golden Corrals. You said that right?
Okay.
There are fewer Golden Corrals out there than there used to be. A lot of them have closed, and I think COVID may be the death knell of buffets. By the way, I think buffets may be completely a thing of the past because we've learned a whole lot about in this time that we've had to contemplate life and greater meaning and our karma. To learn about how infectious places like Golden Corral probably are in terms of they've got sneeze guards, but is that really protecting a whole lot in terms of food preparation? So I think that's
once and never again because it was disgusting.
the Golden Corral.
I went to it once because it was like a school thing. Like everyone just went to that. Everyone and it was nobody ate because it was just not sanitary.
How old were you?
Late middle school, early high school.
So my niece and my nephew, my mother, I had a case in Tulsa, and we were taking my niece and my nephew to Branson, and I had to stop in Tulsa to do depositions in this case. And I was there the whole day, and my mother was, so we checked out of the hotel because we were going to go to Branson, and she was looking for things to do with the kids, and she was running out and they were hungry, and she took them to Golden Corral, and they loved it. Their parents are about organic, literally when my brother and his wife were married, I think we paid in upstate New York one time because my sister-in-law insisted she's a vegetarian, but she realized that the kids need to eat meat, and so she would fix it, but it had to be organic. And so literally, we're at this farmer's market, and it's organic meat, and we paid like $65 for a chicken, for a chicken that had no meat on it. I mean, it was like a free-range dieting chicken that we bought or something, and so they were like, they loved Golden Corral. They're like, do our parents know about this? Because they have the whole chocolate fountain that they could do the marshmallows. Oh, they were just fascinated by Golden Corral. They loved it. But at the time they were like 4 and 5. They're Irish twins, so for 1 month a year they're the same age. But they were just fascinated by Golden Corral. But yeah, I agree. It's cafeteria food is generally kind of chewy and flavorless for the most part. Oops, wait a minute. Did I miss one? Achievers. Achievers have high access to resources. Now, they tend to be, in many instances, first-generation college graduates. And why do I say this? Because they have a me-first attitude. If you come from a family that, and again, when I talk about these characteristics, again, I'm going to point this out. This goes back to marketing research. You cannot apply characteristics of the aggregate to any specific individual, and you cannot, it's a logical fallacy, apply characteristics of an individual and impose it on the aggregate, right? So when I talk about these, remember that there will be exceptions to the rules, but generally speaking, the reason I say that they come from, or their first generation, is because if you came from a family that historically had gone to college and was at least solidly upper middle class, generally you have a tendency to have more social responsibility instilled in you. But these people, because they are first generation, oftentimes believe that they have pulled themselves up by their bootstraps, and if they can do it, you can do it, right? It's just a matter of If you're not achieving what they've achieved, it's just a matter of you're lazy. So they have a tendency to have this me first in terms of their self and their family, right? It's like, I can do this, you can do this. If you're not doing it, you're probably just lazy. They believe that money equals authority. Because they've achieved it, they have some sense of entitlement that goes along with this. So money equals authority. Money equals power. They tend to be goal-oriented and hardworking. They have busy schedules. These are the ones that have their children involved in every activity. They're the soccer moms that run from thing to thing with their kids. They believe in the status quo. They like stability in their lives. As a result, historically, they have tended to vote Republican, although political marketing suggests that particularly among the women of this group, they are now switching because they like the status quo, and they voted Republican because Donald Trump was the Republican candidate, but he has not been status quo in any way, shape, or form. Now, some political scientists would argue that disruption may be a good thing, but they don't like that. They like stability and calm and things like that in their community. They like technology in that it adds to their productivity. Not that it's useful, right? Thinkers, it's all about is it useful to me? So can I read my book while I'm on the plane more conveniently? So will I use a Nook or something like that? That's useful, but they like it not just so that it's useful, but added to that such that it is productive. Like, how is this technology going to help me? Not only is it useful, but is it going to help me do something? Is it going to help me achieve a goal? Like, give me an extra 5 minutes at the end of the day to, focus on running or something like that. They are enormously peer conscious. So they tend to follow what their peers are doing. So they are attracted to whatever is the latest fad among what they perceive as being their peer group. And they're usually professionals. So they tend to be, again, first generation doctors, lawyers, accountants, engineers, things like that. So what kinds of restaurants are going to be attractive to achievers?
The melting pot.
The melting pot, I think that's correct, because it's an experience, right? They are highly interested in experiences. So I think that's an experience. If you've never been there, it's an experience. What else is going to be attractive to achievers? You all don't remember this, but I remember when the first sushi restaurant came into Oklahoma. And I thought, that won't last. Raw fish. Oklahomans, when I was growing up, first of all, I grew up on a cattle ranch, and so I was always somewhat offended by the fact that my father insisted that steak had to be eaten rare. Like, rare. That's the only way we eat steak. That's the only way you can truly, if you are evaluating quality of steak, that's the only way you can truly evaluate. Everything tastes like leather if you overdo it, right? So most people in Oklahoma loved their steak to be either medium well or well done in Oklahoma when I was growing up. That was a big deal. It was like, well done. And then they wanted A1 sauce on it. That also is something that would send my father, if anybody says steak sauce within a 5-mile radius of he just goes ballistic. So the first sushi restaurant opens, and I thought, this will never last. The raw fish, no. But it's something that achievers, it's when it first came out, it's no longer. Once you start getting sushi in the gas station, which I'm a little skeptical of eating sushi from the gas station, little skeptical about that, people. But once you start getting sushi in the gas station, it's no longer sort of a cool an interesting new thing to do. But when it came out, I think that was something that they definitely would have been interested in. HelloFresh, I think that, yes, they would. So somebody said it's not a restaurant, but would they be attracted to? Yeah, I think they would be attracted to things like HelloFresh and those kinds of fix it yourself, but don't really have to fix it yourself because we planned it all out for you and it takes 15 minutes or less to do. Cold Stone Creamer, where they make the ice cream in front of you, I think that's also a good candidate.
Sushi Nico?
Sushi Nico, I think is, yeah. Somebody said volcanic sushi, so I think those are all. And now, if they eat sushi, which they do, because that's one of the things that their peer group is going to be interested in, it's now going to be about what's the latest and greatest sushi restaurant, right? What is the newest one that has the absolute best sort of product on, out there. The big thing with them right now that I can tell are fusion restaurants. What are fusion restaurants? It's like a blend of two, right, styles of food. On the other end, those that are motivated by experiences with low access to resources are strivers. Strivers switch jobs regularly for advancement. They enjoy video games and fantasy. They're fun-loving. They are the center of low-status street culture. So where do you find strivers? Now, again, you'll find interesting combinations of these people in together in various places. You find strivers in Oklahoma City in places like Paseo, the Plaza District, right? Those are not like really upscale, but they are like cool and hip right now. When Bricktown first really became going, you found a lot of strivers at Bricktown doing things like that. But there's all kinds of, like the street truck tacos, things like that are often interesting to them. They desire to better their lives, but they oftentimes have a difficult time achieving that. And they have a tendency to wear their wealth. Why do they wear their wealth? It's not to say I'm rich, but it's to say I'm not poor. So they have a tendency to like to wear their wealth. What kinds of restaurants do you think would be attractive to strivers?
Indie restaurants.
Huh?
Indie restaurants.
Indie restaurants. Yeah.
Like weird
Taco,
mixes and stuff.
sauced.
Yeah. Sauced. I think anything like the Paseo, the Plaza District, somewhat Midtown, although Midtown is becoming more gentrified than it once was. But Plaza is now the newest sort of area that's kind of being rehabbed and re-urbanized. But they used to do, when I first came back to Oklahoma City, Hacienda Street Tacos. Okay, why Hacienda? I don't know what Hacienda Street Tacos is, I guess. So give me an answer and I'll read it in a second. They did this thing, now it's established. It just started out as the food trucks showing up there at H and 8th, which was Hudson and 8th. And they've now actually got a dedicated sort of area for food trucks. I think that would all be interesting and places that strivers would enjoy going. Experiencers. So experiencers have high access to resources. They want everything. They're extremely fashion conscious. So they want the latest fashions. They tend to go against the grain. So these are your Lady Gagas, people who will wear stuff that is really sort of out there, but is high fashion, haute couture. They tend to be social. Spanish style restaurant and bar, okay. I can see that, yeah. That's become a big thing. In Oklahoma, going back to the previous slide. They're spontaneous, they like physical activity, and they have a heightened sense of visual stimulation. So they really, really like things. Virtual reality is really big for experiencers. Doing the whitewater rapid, I think I told you all this before. We have one of a handful of man-made whitewater rapid courses in the United States, and it's down on the Riverwalk. That's something that they would like to do. The ropes course at the Riverwalk is stuff that experiencers would like. So what kind of food, what kinds of restaurants are they going to be interested in?
Maybe whiskey cake?
Okay, whiskey cake. Again, that was one that we used, and there you can use multiple restaurants for the same thing. I just think as long as you have an example, I think, yeah, because it is about what? It's about an experience. And what does Whiskey Cake have in their bar? They have like 60 different microbrewery taps. Here in Edmond, what's something that's similar, it's not food, but in terms of the bar service that they have, is Patriarch. Patriarch is now expanded. They have, and I think that would be interesting to experiencers down. And Scissortail Park, what is the name of that? It's not the Collective.
Blue Garden?
No, it'll come to me in a minute. It's on the west side of Scissortail Park, and it's basically the Patriarch's bar, and then they have a actual restaurant in there as well, along with it. I'm trying to think what else. Social Capital, that's it. Somebody texted Social Capital. Yeah, I think that's one that they would really like. Things like that, because it's all about an experience, right? It's about beer flights and tasting different beer, most of which are just god awful, but it's all about, sort of the experience of things. The lower access to resources are makers. So these are your crafters. These are people that you're going to find at, how many of you have been to something called, and I'm not trying to identify you as being part of this group, because I've been there, I will tell you that. Again, I'm a marketer, I like to go and see what people would rather have than their own money. Affair of the Heart. How many of you have been to Affair of the Heart? You'll find a lot of these people at Affair of the Heart. That's all about crafting and making things and coming up with stuff and different ideas. They love outdoor activities, hunting and fishing. They have a huge distrust of government. They are the most likely to own not one, but multiple guns because they like hunting and fishing. They also believe in protecting what's theirs. They are the most interested in owning land outside the city. Why is that? Well, if you have a distrust of government, what do cities do? Cities, oftentimes, most cities with the exception of Houston, which I believe is the only major metropolitan city in the United States that does not have Euclidean zoning, they don't like zoning. They believe that it's my land, by God, I bought it, and in theory, that should be correct, right? But cities have a tendency to engage in Euclidean zoning. I think Euclid, New York, was the first city to institute zoning. And so what is zoning? Well, it says that you cannot go or deviate from it, allows for urban planning from the use to which the land has been zoned. So, for example, there are lots of spaces in Edmond that have been designated in zone R1. What does R1 zoning mean? It means that you can only build on those lots single-family residential units. You cannot build multi-family residential units. You cannot use R1 zoning, residential single-family units. You can't put in a gas station, a skunk works, anything like that. These people have a tendency to believe it's my land, I bought it, I own it, it's my right, I should be able, so they're most likely to want to live outside the city where you are less likely to have things like zoning laws. They're also the most likely to, if they build their own and it may not meet code, which is something else. They don't trust, you don't need to tell me what's safe, I know what's safe. I don't need that tampered glass in the bathroom. I'll just put any old window I want in there. So what do you think makers like? I will tell you, this is the one that I think appeals to Cracker Barrel appeals to them, right? Like there's all kinds of little craft stuff in the store. It's sort of, traditional. They have strong belief in gender roles. They believe in gender identity. So, like, how many of you have seen a show called Their Own Cooking? Yeah, they're most likely to, if you're talking about, I think, VALS makers, yes, they're the most likely to do their own cooking. Chipotle, is that for, that must have been for experiencers, I think. I've fallen behind, I'm sorry. Social Capital, somebody came up with one that I wanted. The Collective, that's another one that experiencers, that's one that I think people would like. Makers, I think they like Cracker Barrel because it's strongly, harkens back to like this time, before the 1950s, when it was sort of the idealized version of what people think of as being sort of the good old days. So this strong belief in sort of those gender roles. What else? Anybody come up with anything else? Somebody asked the question, would makers support anarchy? Not necessarily. They would support limited government. They tend to be, they don't tend to be anarchists. They tend to be what we might call extreme libertarians. And what do I mean by extreme libertarians? Well, for example, makers are one of the groups that are most likely to have not believe in public education. Like if you want to educate your kids, you educate. I mean, like they literally think we should do away with public education. They believe that we should have a strong military for defense, and that we should have police departments, but it should be very limited, right? I mean, like crimes should be sort of limitedly defined. What's a crime? Well, killing and stealing. That's pretty much it for them. If you steal my stuff or you kill my family, but beyond that, they don't think we should have a whole lot of rules or regulations concerning things like whether or not your kids can ride around. I have had cases in Logan County that have involved, custody cases where the wife insists that the kids can't ride around in the back of the pickup. That's a final tradition, by the way, in rural areas for kids to ride around. It's horribly unsafe. I did it as a kid. Growing up on a farm, you ride around the back of the pickup all the time. Let's see what else. What other things might makers enjoy in terms of food? So, I was trying to think. I've lost my train of thought. I'm trying to keep up with this. With the stream. They also, I think, would enjoy probably one of the ones that you all already came up with, which would be Golden Corral. I think that's a big one where, you can pick what you want and sort of have, a variety, but it's still very mainstream and traditional.
Just because of the theming of it, Toby Keith's I Love This Bar and Grill.
Absolutely. I think, Toby Keith's is going to be, in Bricktown, you see a wide variety of people, and I think you're absolutely going to see makers at Toby Keith's. That just appeals to that, country and western sort of down home, strong, masculine values that they perceive as being right. The lowest access to resources are survivors. They're enormously risk adverse. Now, I told you before in the last period, if I didn't, I will say it now, and it's a good time to repeat it. The biggest change in terms of a transfer of wealth in the last 30 to 40 years has been from young to old. But it has become a bimodal transfer of wealth. There are many people who are blue collar who, historically speaking, older people were not wealthy unless you had a farm, you gave the farm to your kids, and then you hoped that they would take care of you when you got old and sick, right? But because you weren't able to be productive, generally speaking, wealth was concentrated in people who were active in the production of stuff. That's no longer the case. There's been a huge transfer of wealth in this country from young to old because of things like retirement plans and pensions and 401ks and 403bs and things like that. And so a lot of those older people who were white collar or entrepreneurs were able to save a lot of money and were able to accumulate wealth and maintain and hold on to that wealth and then pass that wealth on to their children. But the opposite end of the spectrum is also true. There's some disparity. They tend to be older. These were blue collar workers who maybe didn't work for companies that had pension plans. They were not able to save. And so they have the least access to resources. As a result, they're enormously risk adverse. They're very thrifty, extraordinarily brand loyal. Of any of the groups, they watch the most television. They're the least likely to have a computer or cable. In many instances, you'll find these people that they still have analog, you can buy these still. I know it's amazing to think. You can still buy analog receiver antennas that will get 4, 5, 9 and like PBS and stuff like that. They're the most likely to have that, and the most likely to have only a landline. Or if they have a cell phone, it's one of those that's very limited. It's basically kind of like an emergency use only type cell phone. These are the people who love McDonald's. So in my doctoral program, I had 2 professors that were a husband and wife team. Both of them had risen from very modest beginnings. Both of their parents were extraordinarily poor, and as a result, they were both supporting basically their parents. But David, and these 2 professors had both become vegans. Although the wife was a much more committed vegan than the husband. I one time saw David at an Outback, and I'm like, David, I thought you were a vegan. He's like, well, don't tell Grace Ann. So he's like, once a year when she goes to a conference, I cheat. And I go, and I'm like, that's not vegan, David. So anyway, but he was talking about traveling across country with his wife. They had basically brought his wife's family to Las Cruces. They bought a home for them, and because they were really poor. And he said, when they would travel back and forth, because they'd want to go see their family, and I can't remember where it was in Appalachia that they were from. But it was like, David, can we go to McDonald's? We want to stop at McDonald's. They're the group they love McDonald's, right? I mean, it's cheap, it's fast, and they think it's good. It's got it's chewy chicken. Right, the chicken McNuggets are like, there's no flavor to it. So that's the group that's most likely to be attracted to McDonald's. Again, we all go to McDonald's, right? Some of us more or less than others, but most of us don't love it. Like these people actually loved McDonald's. That was their favorite place to go. McDonald's, by the way, is still a big deal in Russia. In Russia, it takes like, the average person, it's over a day's salary or something to eat at McDonald's. So it's still like a really big deal. It's not a big deal in the United States.
What about Brahms?
Oh, somebody, Mr. McClendon said, would they like something like Little Caesars where pizza's only $5? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's a very, cheap, good, fast, and not a big expenditure of resources. Brahms, somebody did say that in my first class as well. I think absolutely they would like Brahms, right? It's ice cream and it's cheap. You can get a bag. You can get a bag of burgers for $5.99 or something like that.
What about like Waffle House or something like that?
I think Waffle House, IHOP, stuff like that would also probably be attractive to survivors because again, it's cheap. It's American food. It's standard. There's no spice involved there, or very little spice. There's a question, what religion are survivors? Most of them tend to be standard sort of Protestant denomination, Southern Baptist. There are books, if you're interested in that, there are books that talk about socioeconomic classes among religions. The 2 religions that have the tendency to have the highest socioeconomic class are Jews and Episcopalians, by the way, in the United States. Any questions about VALS? All right, let's talk about B2B. So this is the critical thinking challenge that I've started for you, and this is where I want to highlight the difference between what I expect for an essay in this, and I've really, really struggled with this, and so I apologize that I'm so late getting sort of around to this, but if you look at the syllabus, if you looked at it, which you should have by this point, you'll see that the components of the grades are made up of exams, critical thinking challenges, and then an article review, which we'll talk more about the article review when we get closer to that, and I'll do a lecture on how to use logic and critical thinking in the article review. I'm not looking for, historically what I've done in these classes for the critical thinking challenges, I've made them a in-class project where you get in groups of about 5 people and you discuss it, and you come up with something and we talk about it in class. Obviously, because of social distancing, that's becoming enormously problematic. And what I normally did was I would say, well, I'll give it to you this time and it'll be due in the next class period, but I'll give you an actual week to do this. But what I'm looking for in these is not the level of detailed analysis that I was asking for in the exam essay. So if you want to see my comments for the exam essays, you'll have to go into the, I've graded all of them, they should be there. You should have gotten an initial notice that you got a grade because it automatically exports the grades once you submit the exam, but obviously it didn't grade the essay, so that may have created some angst for some of you because you got the grade and it said something like, 48. Well, all it grades is the multiple choice portion of the exam. It doesn't grade the essay part. So I've done that. If you want to see my comments on that, you need to go into the submission, scroll down to the bottom, and then you're going to have to click on the expand feedback module. And so what I look for in that is a much more detailed analysis and specific recommendations. For these, I'm looking for a 5-paragraph essay, but I'm looking for very brief stuff. So what you could do is, this is the critical thinking challenge. Are organizations more rational than individual consumers, and why? What I'm looking for is organizations are something like this. Organizations are made up of individuals who are consumers, and therefore they're no more rational than individuals. Here's 3 examples, A, B, and C. And based on the 3 examples above, I've provided proof that organizations are no more rational than individual consumers, right? I'm going to tell you that's probably the harder position to defend in this critical thinking challenge is that one, but it is defensible. The easy one is to say organizations are much more rational than individuals, right? Because you've got collective thinking and all those kinds of things. So develop a brief 5-paragraph essay to respond. There's a Dropbox in the assignments tab that you can use. You should have an introduction. It can be literally 2 or 3 sentences. I'm not looking for, this case presents an example of where Mr. Mazza is at a theme park with his family that's run by, a big corporation, that kind of thing that you'd have to have an introductory. It's sort of very brief. It is eligible for bonus points, so the more you do, the more likely you are to get bonus points. Again, the harder position to defend, and this would be to say organizations are equally as irrational. It's very easy to say that organizations are very rational, that they operate on rational, because it's not just one individual, and there's some other things that we'll talk about that will allow you to make that argument that they are more rational. So that's on B2L. An overview. When we talk about B2B, we've got 3 broad categories. We've got for-profits, which provide goods and services for profit. That their motive is to make money for either the doing business as, the sole proprietor, the partnership, or the corporation, and ultimately the shareholders of the corporation. And we have not-for-profits. Not-for-profits don't operate for a profit, but they are not an individual consumer. So when we talk about business to business, historically, why we label it business to business, although there are 2 of the 3 categories that we're talking about are not business here, it's because historically marketing as a discipline grew out of this need to market stuff in a industrialized or an emergingly industrial society. And so we focus on business to business, but when we say business to business, it's important to recognize that 2/3 of the categories that we talk about are not businesses in this area. They are nonprofits, which do not exist. They operate like a business. They use accounting like a business, but they don't seek to make a profit for shareholders or for the owner, right? They exist to provide services and meet goals that they have. And then governmental entities, which are enormously important in the business to business context, because if you're selling only to for-profits, lots of businesses fail. 90% of businesses will fail within the first 5 years. That's not stable, but if you can get government contracts, that's a long-term deal generally. And it's guaranteed. The government is not going to go in all likelihood is not going to go broke. Now, governments below the state level can go broke. Technically, they can file for bankruptcy under the bankruptcy code, but it just doesn't happen, right? And state governments can't go broke in the national government. I guess the national government could, in theory, go broke, but it's unlikely, right? So industrial markets. There are 7.7 million entities. These are people who produce or reproduce a product or service for sale. In our country today, 75% of these are now service firms. It's insurance, communications, legal, accounting, financial services. The real value in our economy today is in services. Only 25% are now involved in the selling of primarily physical, tangible goods, like this iPhone. This is a tangible good. These ducks are tangible goods. Lots of this stuff is actually produced not in the United States. This iPhone, for example, is not produced in the United States. It is produced where? It's produced in China. So it's not produced in the United States. The vast majority of the world, if you go outside of the industrialized or post-industrial world, that flips. That number flips. It's exactly the opposite. So China, although in many instances, if you go to big cities, it looks like it's very modern, it is still, in many instances, it is an enormously important, and the size of the economy by sheer virtue of the size of number of people is important, but it's still not a post-industrial economy. They are still manufacturing large amounts of tangible goods. So, but if you're talking about most of Western Europe, the United States, Canada, and Japan, you're talking about most of this is now going to be in services. So for example, the company that I work for, the American Education Corporation, we provided a service. We manufactured, we produced learning management systems for the K-12 market. And so that's where the real value in our economy today is in that services sector. It's also composed of reselling markets. These are people who don't do any processing of the products, right? These are wholesalers and retailers. There are about 1.5 million retailers in the United States. That's probably actually increased until COVID. This number is probably, as a result of COVID, seriously decreased. It is estimated that as many as 40% in some markets of their restaurants, for example, of their independently owned restaurants, which are the vast majority of restaurants still in this country today, have failed as a result of COVID-19. So this number may be down as a result of COVID, the number of retailers that we have. 435 wholesalers, they buy or sell. So in other words, they're not doing anything to the process. That doesn't mean that they don't necessarily somewhat change it. So if we have, for example, wholesalers who cross-dock, they may be taking products and breaking it down. So a wholesaler will not buy, for example, if you want Reese's peanut butter cups, or if you like Reese's peanut butter cups, or if you're selling Reese's peanut butter cups, a wholesaler is going to buy pallets of Reese's peanut butter cups. They're going to then break that down into smaller units because retailers are probably not going to buy pallets. They're going to buy what? Cases of Reese's peanut butter cups, and then you're going to buy the individual Reese's peanut butter cup units, right? So they don't confuse the fact that they are doing something with the product. They're not doing anything though to the actual, peanut butter cup itself. They may be breaking the product down into smaller units, but they're not even really repackaging it. When they break it down into small, usually speaking, they're not repackaging the product because what are they doing? They're not taking those individual Reese's peanut butter cups and selling, breaking that out and then coming up with their own packages for one. They're just breaking it down into smaller and smaller products. In most instances, there are of course exceptions to these sort of broad generalizations, right? Governmental entities. We have three levels. We have federal, state, and local. Two of these entities are listed in the United States Constitution: the federal and the state. The local is not. When we talk about governments from a practical standpoint, we only have dual sovereignty or federalism among two sovereigns, that's federal and state, but for all intents and practical purposes, we have three levels of government. We have the federal government, the national government at the top, we have state governments in the middle, and then we have local governments, which are creations of the state, but oftentimes operate very, very independently. So the state of Oklahoma, for example, because we have home rule in our municipalities, if you're a municipality of a certain size or larger, you can have home rule, which means you're a charter city. That gives you an enormous amount of autonomy. The city of Guthrie operates very independently of the state of Oklahoma. In theory, the state of Oklahoma could destroy that, but it's unlikely, right? I mean, they operate with a great degree of autonomy. And so when we talk about it from a marketing perspective, we talk about 3 levels of governmental entity that you have to deal with. There are about 89,500 entities, and again, if you can get into selling to these, it can be a very stable, long-term relationship that you can establish, and it can be very profitable. So how do we measure this, and how do we figure out how we're going to sell and what we're going to sell and where are our opportunities? Well, there is a source of secondary data that provides a lot of this. It's the North American Industrial Classification System in the United States, Canada, and Mexico, which used to be called NAFTA, which they've renamed under the Trump administration as USMCA, I think, United States, Mexico, and Canada. It's basically NAFTA for all intents and purposes with a few modifications. So this provides studies of market share, demand for goods and services among the 3 in the agreement, to the agreement, and it tells us about import competition. So it's for demand for goods and services, import competition, and market share. The system is predicated on a 6-digit code. The first 2 digits of the code represent broad, so it goes from broad to narrow. So the first 2 digits of the code, and you can get data on these various things, represent the sector. So for example, agriculture, mining, or construction. Those are broad categories, right? Within agriculture, let's think about this, there are all kinds of different types of agriculture, right? There's everything from cattle production to the growing of wheat, and then the processing of those products, right? Bringing farm to market. Dairy producers, cheese producers are involved technically in sort of agricultural stuff. Mining and then construction. Then we can go to the 3rd level, which is the 3rd number, which represents a specific subsector. So for example, if we started with construction, it would be 23. And then within construction, we could have construction of buildings, which would be 6, as opposed to civil engineering, which would be 7. So what's the difference between construction of buildings? Well, construction of buildings versus civil engineering. Construction of buildings would be things like this. This is a building, right? A house is a building. As opposed to civil engineering. What's civil engineering? Well, that's roads, bridges, infrastructure type stuff, airports. So within that, when we talk about construction of buildings, we have a wide variety there as well. So we can break it down even further into a specific 4th industry group. So for example, if we had construction, then construction of buildings, then we can go to residential buildings, 1. And then the 5th will designate a specific industry. So if we talk about residential buildings, within the residential building sector, right, there's all kinds of things. It's not just residential construction, which would be home builders. You also have what? What else is involved in that? We have suppliers of things like electrical, plumbing, HVAC, concrete, wood, right? So then we get more specific, residential building construction. And then the 6th is the individual country level national industries. For example, new single-family residential housing, which would be 5, or multifamily residential housing construction, which would be apartments and duplexes, which would be 6. It allows for the determination of and the identification of growth potentials for marketers within these sectors. And it allows us to determine marketing opportunities within these sectors if we've got businesses that operate with them. There is a limitation. The 5-digit code is not available if there are too few organizations that exist. So at the 6th digit, If there are too few, so for example, when you get down to specific auto manufacturing, for example, in the manufacturing sector, there are lots of things that, if you're talking about the auto manufacturing sector, well, we're talking about a big sector of the economy. We're talking about manufacturing, right? Automobiles. There are lots of plants on the southern border that supply components to auto manufacturers in the United States. But there are not a huge number of those actual manufacturers, auto manufacturers. I don't think Mexico actually manufactures any of its own automobiles anymore. Right? They're all manufactured primarily. Now, the average car, even if it says made in America and it was manufactured in Detroit, I think most of the components in that car will have crossed the US, Mexico, and Canada border something like, the last statistic I read was something like 10 times, right? But they don't have actual car manufacturing. I think they do have plants now, but it's Ford plants that are actually in Mexico, right? So when you get to, if there are not enough of that particular in the sector, it may not be available, but it's not available for all countries in the treaty if too few organizations exist for us to collect the data on that. So characteristics of B2B buying. B2B buying is really characterized by derived demand as opposed to primary demand. What does this mean? Well, it's predicated on organizations' constituents. In other words, UCO doesn't buy anything for its own sake because it values it for its own sake. You may buy things because you value them for the sake that it gives you or your family or for itself. Art, for example, is something that you might value in and of its own sake. We don't value that as an institution for its own sake. We value it for what it does for our constituents. So UCO buys arts, right? But we buy it mostly to sort of, create an atmosphere here that makes this a welcoming place for you, not because we want it for ourselves. So the demand is derived. It's predicated on the needs of the organization's constituents. They're not buying anything because they want it intrinsically. They're buying it to satisfy their constituent needs. Typically, the purchases are larger in business to business. Even if you're thinking about a small business like a family-run convenience store and gas station, there are lots of these in the metro area. They're buying Reese's peanut butter cups, but they're not buying individual packages of Reese's peanut butter cups, right? They're buying what? They're buying cases of Reese's peanut butter cups. So it's usually larger, although maybe not, but usually it's larger. There are smaller numbers than in the business to consumer. So for example, Ford sells to roughly 31,000 dealerships across the United States, who then sell to millions of customers. So if you're talking about, selling to Ford dealers, you've only got 3,100 if that's what your market is. Why would you want to sell it? Well, it's more stable, it's longer term, but they're going to sell to millions of customers, right? And the buying objectives are generally, and this is as a result of the fact that two of the three categories, generally speaking, if you were looking at purely business, it would either be to increase profits or increase revenues. But in many instances, the characteristics are to reduce costs. So if you're a governmental entity, your biggest things are usually not necessarily to increase profits, it's to reduce your costs. So you look at buying objectives and the objectives. Now, this is one of the things that you can use as an example, but you're gonna have to come up with a specific example of this is why it's more rational, because their objective is not to buy something because they want it. It's to reduce costs or increase profitability, right? Increase revenues. The buying criteria. The buying criteria is really important when we start talking about business to business. Now, this is an interesting example. Price. If you have, and particularly if you are looking at low risk purchases as a consumer, you may not be very price sensitive. What's low risk? So for example, it's late one night, you're on the road, you're about to stop, you realize you've forgotten toothpaste, and you stop at the convenience store to get toothpaste. Now you're probably gonna pay at a convenience store, and I've done this recently because I've been on the road. Oops, forgot my toothpaste. And you're probably gonna pay $5 for a tube of toothpaste that is considerably smaller than what you could buy it at if you were in, say, example, Walmart, right? But like you're in some small town, like I was, traveling back from New Mexico. I had a court case in New Mexico. Traveling back, got tired, got a hotel room, stopped. This was in Tucumcari, no Walmart there. May have been Santa Rosa. Horrible place, by the way, horrible place to stop. No Walmart, you know, only thing that's open is the Allsups. Allsups are a big brand in New Mexico. Paid $5 for a tube of toothpaste, right? That's not terribly important. If you are a business consumer though, if you're buying for a business, price is going to be critical because it's going to affect what you can deliver goods and services to your constituents or your customers. And so it's going to be a critical aspect. Now, the interesting thing about this, as a marketer, I focus a lot on price because price is the component where when we talk about the 4 Ps, we organize marketing around these 4 Ps: product, price, place, and promotion. Price, as we'll see, is one that represents the other 3 really, really well, and we'll talk about why that is when we get to the price component of the marketing mix. But I point this out as a marketer, it's really, really critical. As a lawyer in business-to-business transactions, this is one of these interesting things when we think about the regulatory environment and how the regulatory environment impacts us as marketers. Price is not critical for lawyers because under the UCC, price is not a critical factor in determining whether or not you have a contract. So businesses engage in course of dealings all the time, and if there's no price, you can still have a contract with that business, and they can still sue you in the regulatory environment, even though price as a businessman may be critical to you. A court's going to say that's not a critical factor in determining whether or not you have a contract. That's really important, isn't it? To think about this is how the regulatory environment involves things like this. Price is not the critical aspect with regard to contracts under the UCC, which is a radical departure from what we would have thought. You would have thought price is pretty important, and for businesses it really is pretty important because the profit margins generally on things are so small in the business-to-business market, particularly, you know, it's 1% to 2% in many industries, that you're going to think that that's a really important factor, right? Delivery schedules generally become very important. Time of the essence, regulatory environment, and just-in-time inventory controls become very, very important in terms of these things. So in terms of the regulatory environment, having these clauses in your contract that say time is of the essence, and if you do not meet the demand schedule, there are draconian penalties for your producer. If I'm manufacturing Reese's peanut butter cups and I'm using just-in-time, which they are, just-in-time inventory control, if I don't get my peanut butter on time, what does that mean to my processing? It means I have to shut down the whole plant. If I don't get my, and so you insert these things into your contracts and say, you better give me. And one of the things that COVID has highlighted is it's been enormously disruptive to the supply chain. How many of you were unable to find things that you normally got in the store? One of the things that I am addicted to are those stupid wipes. I love, and during, like, all of a sudden for like, you know, 7 weeks during COVID, it was a good thing I had a little supply hoarded away of those wipes because I'm addicted to them. Like, couldn't find them. Could not find those stupid wipes because it totally disrupted the supply chain. What kinds of clauses do you have in the regulatory environment? Technical capabilities are going to be really important. And I'll give you an example of this. So when you buy a computer, you don't really think about all of the technical specifications. You're looking at, does it do what I want it to do? Can I get online? Does it do some word processing? And does it allow me to, you know, do some Excel and stuff like that? Can I surf the web? Can I write my reports? That's what you all primarily use computers for, right? But when we look at computers from an organizational standpoint, we have far more specific requirements. What are they? So for example, the company I used to work for when I was in the private sector manufactured learning management systems for the K-12 market. Now, at the K-12 market, when you manufacture a learning management system, it has to have content along with it because we do not allow teachers at the primary and secondary level to put in their own content for the most part. It has to come content loaded. Like I have to load all the content into D2L that I want you to have. So we have to load the content. That has to meet 50 state standards. There are 50 states that have different standards on what you have to teach students, and we had to load that. So this was very, very specific, and I can give you an example of how specific this stuff was. I had a friend who decided he wanted to write a textbook when I was a political science professor. He wanted to write a textbook for American national government, but he wanted to write it for the high school and junior high level, right? So you can take in Oklahoma civics, I think you take it in 8th grade, and you can take like American national government in 9th grade or 10th grade. There are only about 20 people who write textbooks for that market. There are only about 20. At the college level, because I can adopt whatever textbook I want as a professor, and there's no restrictions by a curriculum committee or something like that that tell me what I can adopt, there are about 300 at any given time people that have written American national government textbooks. So if you just do the math on this, it's a lot more profitable. If you're doing this to make money, it's a lot more profitable to market that to that market. In order to sell, and in order to get the curriculum committee to approve any like software that we produce for the American Education Board, you have to get the approval of at least, and generally more, but at least 2 major markets, California and Texas. Why is that? They're both big states and they're both young states. Unlike New York and Florida, which are big states, those are older states. They don't have as many school-age children. California and Texas are the 2. Now this is really, really tricky because California and Texas are politically diametrically opposite. When he wrote the textbook and he talked about this model of federalism that I talked about in this classroom in here, this marble cake, layer cake model of federalism, we talk about that a lot in political science. The California Curriculum Committee said, unless you take that out of your textbook, we won't approve it. What? Why? Because it promotes unhealthy eating habits among students. To talk about cake. No kidding. That's, so these are the kinds of things that become, if you're going to read a book about American national government, you're not thinking about, or buy a learning management system, you're not thinking about stuff like that. If you're going to buy stuff for your homeschool kid, you're not thinking about like that, right? But those are the kinds of crazy kinds of technical requirements that you can get when you start talking about business-to-business operations. And with that, I'm out of time. I will see you all. If you got ducks, be sure to come up. Let me stop the live stream. For those of you that are in the extended section, I will get your bonus points posted just as soon as I can.